I love to read a book and be absorbed in words to escape. Hi everyone, so this is part 2 of my recommendations for fairy tale and fantasy anthologies, so let's get cracking. A title that I was extremely excited to discover, even though it took a great deal of effort and back and forth to actually get my hands on it, is Shelf Life, Fantastic Stories Celebrating Bookstores. I'd never heard of this one before. I believe it was published in 2002 and it's very hard to get. I think I had to use the ISBN in order to track it down. As you might have guessed from the title, it concerns fantastical, horror, supernatural stories set in bookshops, which is just fantastic, as I am a bibliophile and a lover of magical stories. It has an introduction by Neil Gaiman talking about why bookstores are fantastic and why it's wonderful to support them. There's an inclusion by an Australian author I really love, Marion DePere. She's in here, which was part of the reason I wanted to get it. There's classic authors like Charles DeLint. He has a story in here about computer pixies, which is nifty. And my favourite story was one entitled The Hemingway Kittens, which featured cats in a bookstore and their magical powers, which was just so brilliant. So if you can find Shelf Life, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. For lovers of more literary fiction fare, you've got A.S. Byatt's The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye, 5 fairy stories. This one is certainly more adult and, I suppose if you want to say, sophisticated in tone. It's a little more obscure with the language. The concepts aren't as immediate, I suppose, as possibly more traditional fairy tale fare, but the symbolism is rife, which is very much a fairy tale standard. And there's some really evocative, very lyrical stories to find in here. The title story, the Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye, takes up at least half of this book, so I would dub it more a novella. But one of my favourite story in here is The Glass Coffin. But these are just certainly very interesting tales and a bit of a different take on folklore, and it's nice to see really notable acclaimed authors like A.S. Byatt having an interest in these kind of narratives. Quickly going into more Australian patriotism for a moment, Isabel Carmody, you know that I love her. She's got a number of fantasy anthologies out and about, 2 that I own. The first one, Green Monkey Dreams, which was published in the mid-90s I think, and a more recent one, Metro Winds. And these have both folklore and just high fantasy concepts abounding in them, all different kind of flavours of stories to be found. And I'm just a big fan of Isabel's writing style, so perhaps if you haven't encountered any of her novels before, maybe see if you can grab an anthology first, see if you like her style. An author who's quite well known in amongst fairy tale fans is Margot Lanigan, another Aussie author. She's somewhat infamous for her very graphic, very brutal, very hard-hitting novel, Tender Morsels. She's also getting a lot of acclaim for a more recent fairy tale folklore publication. In Australia it's entitled Sea Hearts. I believe it has a different title in America. I will put that down here. It's getting a lot of critical acclaim, which is fantastic. I just like seeing Aussie authors do well. But she has a number of anthologies out as well. 2 that I own are Yellow Cake and White Time. I would say that Margot's writing style and the content that she likes to focus on is sort of a love it or hate it thing for a lot of people, so possibly maybe encountering some of her short fiction is wise if you're curious but don't want to jump straight into one of the novels. I think that Margot's insanely talented, but I've met Margot and she's really lovely. Another lovely lady I've met who is Australian and who is also beloved by many fairy tale fans is Juliet Marilia. She's quite well known for her Seven Waters series. Many people adore The Daughter of the Forest, which is a take on an Irish folk tale, The Six Swans. And I personally highly recommend her adult retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which is entitled Heart's Blood. It is excellent, a really fantastic standalone adult fairy tale retelling. Read it if you have not, because truly it's brilliant. It's one of the best novels I've read. She has a short fiction collection out though called Prickle Moon. I'm not sure how readily available this is internationally, but it's a really beautiful, really lovely collection of stories. Lots of more local folklore is focused on in here, which is really nice to see. She's just a really lovely writer, and I find it hard pressed to imagine that people won't enjoy her writing. Moving on now to classics. One of the first things I want to mention is a non-fiction essay-ish title by J.R.R. Tolkien, in fact, and this is on fairy stories, and it's his analysis of fantasy tropes and the popularity of fairy tales in literature and in popular culture, and why they're so resonant with children and why they're important and why we should honour them and give them due attention and credit. It's just a really passionate argument in favour of fairy tales and fantasy narratives, and if anyone knows what they're talking about, it's Tolkien, so pick this up. I was so excited when I finally found this one day. I freaked out with joy. If you're going to talk about classic fairy tales, of course you're going to mention the Brothers Grimm. I have a few editions of their tales. Some are more comprehensive than others. You also want to make sure, if you can, that you're not getting abridged versions of the tales. I had this one that I had to purchase when I did Myth and Fairy Tale for university. Almost everything is featured in here. A slightly smaller collection that I still love is this one. This one has sentimental value because my friend did the artwork on the cover, and isn't that fantastic? Many people, of course, know Brothers Grimm fairy tales, but what's really wonderful to find when you're actually investigating the stories in here is that there are so many that you've probably never heard of and never encountered before, and these might well become your favourites. They're wacky and weird, some are very violent, some are very misogynistic, some have questionable morals, to say the least, but they're just memorable, magical, and I really enjoyed discovering all these new tales that I hadn't grown up on. You have like your standard, I don't know, 10 or so that are pretty much to be featured in, you know, any storybook collection, any illustrated anthology for children, and certainly to influence many films and television shows and whatnot. But there are so many more to find and enjoy. One of my favourites, for example, is the Juniper Tree, and in fact the Juniper Tree inspired the title of this Kate Bernheimer anthology, My Mother She Killed Me, My Father He Ate Me. One of the other go-to authors for traditional fairy tales is Charles Perrault. I have an illustrated anthology that was sent to me by Lara because she's lovely, and it's illustrated by Gustave Doré, which is a big deal because his illustrations are quite synonymous with fairy tales, have become almost equally as famous as some of the tales themselves. I do want to get my hands one day on Jack Zipes' edited an anthology of French fairy tales, obviously featuring Perrault's works, but also other authors of like the traditional French folklore, including the first published, to my knowledge, version of Beauty and the Beast. You'll find that Perrault's tales more often than not are in fact the basis of most Disney fairy tale films. A lot of the tropes and characters and plot features that you'll recognise from Disney films growing up have in fact been lifted from Perrault's versions of the stories rather than the Grimm brothers. And Perrault is also very well known for the morals that he liked to tack on at the end of his stories, which are often hilarious, often upsetting. There'd be a moral, and perhaps even another moral, just in case you weren't being hit over the head enough. Possibly one of the most well-known is the almost slut-shaming little rant that he goes on at the end of Red Riding Hood, warning young women to not be too pretty, not be promiscuous, and stay away from men while they're out on their own, which they shouldn't be anyway. If you want some overtly, obviously didactic moral inclusions in your tales, then certainly check out Perrault. Just a quick note to say that the slut-shamey aspect of Red Riding Hood was one of the few things that did genuinely impress me right at the beginning of Once Upon a Time when it came on as a TV series, because I recall the way they presented Ruby when we first met her in Storybook, and thinking that was actually a subtle and quite clever nod to a lot of the misogynistic undertones that people have linked to the Red Riding Hood tale. Moving into the much more bittersweet, much more melancholy fairy tales, we have, of course, Hans Christian Andersen. Is very well known for many tales such as The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Princess and the Pea, The Snow Queen, Thumbelina. His tales often incorporated very conscious Christian overtones and symbolism. I don't think that detracts in any way from the heartfelt, moving quality of the tales. As a reader, you don't have to have particular religious affiliations in order to still get something out of the stories themselves. They're just very memorable for how beautiful and how heartbreaking many of them are. A lot of critics and historians have claimed that there's a great deal of autobiography woven into a lot of Andersen's tales, and if you know anything about his life and his upbringing and the ultimate loneliness of his existence, then you can certainly see a great deal of that, especially in most of his protagonists. And if you only really know the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, brace yourself and have a read of Andersen's original tale because great many differences. Another collection that has quite a bittersweet tone to it is Oscar Wilde's fairy stories. Again, there are some somewhat heavy Christian analogies that are featured in these tales. As always, I don't think it gets in the way of the storytelling at all. Oscar Wilde's well known for his biting humour and social commentary, and it's still in here, it's just gentler and a little more subtle. But you can certainly still pick up on the Oscar Wildeness of the writing. And there are just some really lovely tales in here. My favourite is The Happy Prince and The Nightingale and the Rose. I think it's worthwhile to read some Andersen fairy tales and some Wilde fairy tales, possibly alongside one another, because I think they complement each other very nicely. A classic fairy tale author that I had honestly never heard of until about 2 years ago is George MacDonald, and this is The Complete Fairy Tales. George MacDonald was apparently quite an influence on folks such as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien in how they approached the incorporation of folklore with their own unique fantasy creations. His writing was considered quite paradoxical, subversive, experimental, and people have even associated and linked him with somebody like Lewis Carroll in terms of how he incorporated wordplay and that sort of thing into his stories. There's quite an adult feeling to these tales, but the ones I've read thus far I have really enjoyed, and I always like discovering new people who are apparently very well known in a field that I really love. So yeah, if you can find some George MacDonald stories, certainly pick them up. And finally, hitting you with just some straight out myths, we've got Ovid's Metamorphoses. Plenty of recognisable names feature in here. You have Pygmalion and Persephone and Medusa and the Muses and Orpheus. Lots and lots of folks are in here, all woven together in narratives concerning transformations, both physical and emotional and mental, and how physical change can come about as both a reward and a punishment. A lot of these stories are incredibly graphic and brutal and violent and might leave you a tiny bit emotionally scarred, but they've resonated and continued to stick with us for a reason. Let's just say the Greeks had no problem whatsoever discussing confronting topics. So those were my fairy tale and fantasy anthology recommendations part 2. As I said in the first video, there are so many more titles out there to discover, plenty that I have not read, plenty that I want to own and add to my collection. It is a passion of mine. I do plan on making a video in the future discussing why exactly I like fairy tales so much. Hope you liked those recommendations, and let me know if you do have any favourite classic tales, and let's keep the fairy tale love going. Hooray! Okay, that's all for now. Bye everybody.